The sharp clink of crystal echoed through the spacious, dimly lit office as Lee Jung-woo placed his untouched glass of whiskey on the edge of his sleek black desk. His gaze lingered on the floor-to-ceiling windows, where the sprawling Sunlight Plaza shimmered under the city lights. The scene below should have filled him with pride, a testament to his years of work, calculated risks, and undeniable brilliance as the CEO. Instead, a peculiar unease gnawed at him, tightening his chest with each passing moment. On his desk lay a manila folder, its contents spilling like a dam broken. Complaint after complaint, each more scathing than the last. The bolded words seemed to leap off the pages. Toxic, soul-crushing, no one cares. Jung-woo clenched his jaw. It wasn't the complaints that rattled him. After all, customer grievances were part and parcel of running a vast enterprise. No. What disturbed him most were the accusations aimed inward, at his employees. They painted a picture of a hostile workplace, where staff turnover was high and morale was buried beneath endless quotas. As the CEO, Jung-woo prided himself on being meticulous, a man who left no stone unturned. Yet, somehow, this picture, a microcosm of dissatisfaction, had gone unnoticed. His eyes darted to a single piece of paper nestled beneath the sea of reports, a handwritten note on plain stationery. It wasn't typed like the others, and its brevity stood in sharp contrast to the verbose complaints. "You'll never understand what it's really like, not from where you sit." The words felt like a direct challenge, their rawness pricking at his carefully constructed veneer of composure. He turned the note over in his hands, searching for a clue to its sender, but found none. The silence in his office grew heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. Outside, the distant chatter of shoppers filtered through the glass, joyful, chaotic, alive. It was a stark contrast to the stillness that enveloped him. Jung-woo leaned back in his leather chair, his sharp features illuminated by the cold glow of the desk lamp. His angular jaw and neatly styled black hair gave him an air of unapproachable authority, but his eyes, dark and thoughtful, betrayed a lingering vulnerability. "You'll never understand." The words refused to leave his mind. He rose to his feet, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the plush carpeting, and approached the window. From this vantage point, the Sunlight Plaza was a glittering empire, a perfect facade. But what lay beneath? What was hidden in the shadows of the employee corridors, the back offices, and the customer service desks? The answer gnawed at him, louder than any protest. Jung-woo knew he had to confront the truth, and he wouldn't find it from behind a polished desk. It was then that an idea began to take shape. Reckless, unconventional, but necessary. "Mrs. CO," he called out, his deep, commanding voice slicing through the intercom. Seconds later, CO Hye-ran, his ever-efficient HR consultant, entered. She was a woman in her mid-40s, composed and deliberate, with a sharp intuition that made her indispensable to the company. "Sir?" she asked, her brow furrowing as she noticed the intensity in his expression. "I want to understand what's happening," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "Not from reports or secondhand accounts, from the ground level." Hye-ran's lips parted in surprise. "You mean?" "Yes." He straightened his posture, determination hardening his gaze. "I'll go undercover. No one can know who I am." The idea was audacious, even borderline absurd, but in that moment, it felt like the only way. Hye-ran hesitated, clearly weighing the risks. "You realize the implications, Mr. Lee. If anyone finds out—" "They won't," he interrupted, his voice firm but measured. "Not until I'm ready." Hye-ran exhaled sharply. "Then we'll need to craft a convincing backstory. I'll ensure HR processes your alias without raising suspicion." Jung-woo nodded, a flicker of gratitude crossing his face. "Thank you. Keep this between us." As she left, his gaze drifted back to the glowing cityscape. The whispers of discontent from the complaints folder seemed to echo louder now, But so did something else, a spark of resolve. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly as Lee Jung-woo, or rather Lee Min-soo, the new hire, stood awkwardly at the entrance of the customer service department. His once immaculate suits had been replaced with a standard-issue uniform, a button-down shirt with the Sunlight Plaza logo embroidered on the chest, and a pair of dark slacks. He felt smaller somehow, stripped of his usual armor, his polished appearance replaced with something startlingly ordinary. The bustling department was a cacophony of ringing phones, agitated voices, and hurried footsteps. The faint scent of overworked coffee machines lingered in the air. Desks were cluttered with stacks of papers, post-it notes in fluorescent colors, and half-empty water bottles. Though the space wasn't tiny, it felt cramped, its walls seeming to close in with each irate customer call. Jung-woo hesitated for a moment, clutching the employee manual handed to him earlier that morning. It was thin, barely 10 pages, and completely insufficient for what he sensed was the chaos ahead. Min-soo, right? The cheerful voice snapped him out of his daze. He turned to see Kim Min-ji, a young woman in her mid-20s, with a bright smile that seemed almost out of place in the oppressive atmosphere. Her shoulder-length hair was dyed a playful shade of pink, and her oversized glasses magnified her expressive brown eyes. "Yes," he replied curtly, adjusting his grip on the manual. "Don't worry," Min-ji said, her tone light and teasing. "Everyone looks like a deer in headlights on their first day. Come on, I'll show you the ropes." As she led him through the maze of desks, Jung-woo couldn't help but take in the strained faces of his new colleagues. Most were young, like Min-ji, but their postures spoke of exhaustion, their eyes dull from endless interactions with demanding customers. A few exchanged curious glances at the unfamiliar face of the new guy, but their attention quickly shifted back to their work. Min-ji stopped at a vacant desk near the corner of the room. "This is you," she said, gesturing to the outdated computer and headset. "We don't have much personal space, so keep your stuff minimal." Jung-woo frowned slightly but nodded. "Got it." "Good. Now let me introduce you to the boss." Min-ji led him to the center of the room, where a woman stood, her back straight despite the chaos around her. Soo-min, the supervisor, exuded an air of calm authority, though her presence didn't seem to intimidate her team. "Supervisor Han," Min-ji called out, a note of fondness in her voice. Soo-min turned, and for a moment, Jung-woo was struck by her poise. She was in her early 30s, with sharp yet delicate features and an understated elegance. Her hair was tied back in a neat ponytail, and though she wore no makeup, her natural beauty shone through. Her uniform, identical to everyone else's, didn't diminish the quiet confidence she radiated. "This is Lee Min-soo, the new hire," Min-ji explained. Soo-min's eyes met his, and Jung-woo felt a fleeting sense of recognition, though he knew it was impossible. She extended a hand. "Welcome to customer service, Mr. Lee. I hope you're ready for a challenge." Her voice was steady, but not unkind. Jung-woo shook her hand, noting the firm grip. "I'm ready," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "We'll see," Soo-min replied with a small smile. "Min-ji will handle your training for today. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask me." As the day unfolded, Jung-woo was thrown headfirst into the chaotic reality of customer service. Min-ji walked him through the basics of the system: how to log complaints, process refunds, and handle escalations. Though her tone remained cheerful, her hands moved with practiced speed, a sign of how often she'd repeated this process. "Most of the time, it's just routine," Min-ji said, as she demonstrated. "But you'll get the occasional nightmare caller. Oh, and don't take it personally when someone yells at you. It happens to all of us." Jung-woo's first call came sooner than he expected. He hesitated as he placed the headset on, Min-ji giving him a thumbs up from across the desk. "Sunlight Plaza Customer Service. This is Lee Min-soo speaking. How may I assist you?" he said, his voice stilted but polite. The customer on the other end launched into a tirade about a damaged product, their voice rising with every sentence. Jung-woo struggled to keep up, fumbling through the script Min-ji had provided. By the end of the call, his hands were clammy, and he could feel the tension in his shoulders. Min-ji gave him a sympathetic smile. "Not bad for your first time. You didn't hang up, so that's a win." He let out a small chuckle, despite himself. As the hours dragged on, Jung-woo began to observe the cracks in the system. Calls piled up faster than they could be answered, and the team was forced to juggle impossible workloads. He watched as Soo-min stepped in multiple times to handle irate customers, diffusing situations with a calm professionalism that impressed him. But what struck him most was the lack of acknowledgement she received. Despite her efforts, it was clear that the higher-ups dismissed her as just another cog in the machine. By the end of the day, Jung-woo was drained. His body ached from sitting in the uncomfortable chair, and his head throbbed from the constant noise. But it was the emotional weight of the day that lingered, the stark realization of how disconnected he had been from the struggles of his own employees. As he left the department, he glanced back at Soo-min, who was still at her desk, reviewing the day's reports. Her silhouette was framed by the pale glow of her computer screen, a quiet testament to her dedication. Jung-woo felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in years: respect. The next morning greeted Jung-woo with the same cacophony of ringing phones, hurried footsteps, and faint murmurs of frustration from his new colleagues. The customer service department was already buzzing with activity, the chaos beginning before the day even officially started. The air was thick with the hum of outdated air conditioning units, and the faint scent of cheap instant coffee clung to the room like a stubborn reminder of exhaustion. At his desk, Jung-woo, or Min-soo, as he was now known, adjusted the headset on his ears, bracing himself for the flood of customer complaints. "Morning, newbie," Kim Min-ji chirped from her adjacent desk. Her bright demeanor was like a stubborn flame refusing to be extinguished in the dreary office environment. With her pink-streaked hair tied into a loose bun and her glasses perched at the edge of her nose, she leaned over her cubicle to pass him a piece of candy. "You'll need this. Mondays are always wild." "Thanks," Jung-woo replied, pocketing the candy. He couldn't help but admire her resilience. Despite the obvious strain of her job, Min-ji managed to keep a smile on her face, a trait that seemed increasingly rare in the department. Soo-min entered the room shortly after, clipboard in hand and an air of calm efficiency enveloping her. She paused to greet a few employees, offering small words of encouragement to those who looked particularly frazzled. Her presence was magnetic, and Jung-woo found himself watching her closely. She stopped by his desk, her expression soft but businesslike. "Min-soo, how was your first day?" "Challenging but manageable," Jung-woo replied evenly. Soo-min tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You did well. Most people would have run for the door after that first call." Before he could respond, her attention was pulled away by a commotion across the room. A young employee, barely out of university by the looks of him, was on the verge of tears as a customer screamed through the headset. Soo-min approached, her voice calm and steady, and gestured for him to hand over the call. "Good morning, this is Supervisor Han. I understand you're upset, and I'd like to help resolve this for you," she said, her tone a perfect blend of firmness and empathy. Jung-woo watched in quiet awe as she diffused the situation with measured words and a composed demeanor. The once hostile customer left the call pacified, and the young employee looked at Soo-min with a mix of gratitude and relief. "Take a 5-minute break," she told him, her voice kind. "You did fine." Soo-min's ability to handle high-pressure situations with grace was undeniable, but it was equally evident that her workload was overwhelming. Jung-woo made a mental note of how often she had to step in where the system failed, an occurrence far too frequent for his liking. The hours crept by, each one marked by a seemingly endless barrage of complaints. Jung-woo handled his calls with growing competence, but the emotional toll began to weigh on him. Customers often treated the staff as verbal punching bags, their frustrations spilling over in rude or dismissive remarks. By mid-afternoon, the team was visibly drained. Chairs creaked under slumped shoulders, and the once vibrant chatter had dimmed to an occasional murmur. The oppressive atmosphere pressed down on Jung-woo, who was unaccustomed to this kind of unrelenting grind. Min-ji, ever the optimist, tried to lighten the mood. "Okay, team, let's play a game. Worst customer story gets free coffee tomorrow." A few chuckles rippled through the room, though most were too tired to participate. Jung-woo glanced at Min-ji, her eyes sparkling with determination to keep spirits up, and felt an unfamiliar pang of guilt. These were his people, his employees, working in conditions he had never bothered to understand until now. Just as he was beginning to think the day couldn't get worse, Oh Ji-hoon, the department manager, made his entrance. His slicked-back hair and expensive suit were a stark contrast to the tired faces around him. Ji-hoon strutted into the room like he owned it, his expression a mixture of indifference and condescension. "Han Soo-min," he barked, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "Yes, Manager Oh?" Soo-min stepped forward, her calm demeanor unwavering. "The numbers from last week are unacceptable," Ji-hoon said, waving a report in her face. "You're supposed to manage this team, not coddle them. If you can't meet our targets, we'll need to make changes." Jung-woo's jaw tightened as he watched the exchange. Soo-min stood firm, her expression neutral, though her knuckles whitened slightly around the clipboard she held. "With all due respect, Manager Oh," she began, her tone measured. "The team is working at full capacity. The issue lies with the unrealistic targets." "I don't want excuses," Ji-hoon interrupted, his voice dripping with disdain. "Fix it." He stormed out, leaving a palpable tension in his wake. Soo-min exhaled slowly, her shoulders stiff, but her resolve intact. Jung-woo couldn't help but admire her strength, though he also felt a growing anger toward Ji-hoon's blatant disregard for his team's well-being. As the day drew to a close, Jung-woo lingered near his desk, his mind racing with observations. The customer service department wasn't just struggling, it was drowning under the weight of impossible expectations and poor leadership. When Soo-min finally finished her work and began packing up for the night, Jung-woo approached her. "Supervisor Han," he said, his voice quieter than usual. She turned, her expression softening. "Yes, Min-soo?" "I just wanted to say, you're doing an incredible job. I can see how much you care about this team." A flicker of surprise crossed her face, followed by a small, genuine smile. "Thank you, Min-soo. That means a lot." As she walked away, Jung-woo felt the weight of his dual role pressing down on him. He had come to observe, to understand the roots of his company's problems, but what he was witnessing went beyond numbers and reports. This wasn't just a business issue, it was a human one. And for the first time in years, he began to feel the stirrings of something he thought he'd lost. Purpose. Lee Jung-woo, now fully immersed in his role as Lee Min-soo, walked into the customer service department with a newfound clarity. The second day had barely begun, but the oppressive atmosphere weighed on him like a thick fog. Despite the early hour, the phones were already ringing incessantly, their shrill tones competing with the chatter of stressed employees and the hiss of the aging coffee machine sputtering out another pot of subpar caffeine. Jung-woo adjusted the headset resting around his neck, scanning the room with careful eyes. He wasn't just here to endure the chaos today. He was here to observe the unspoken dynamics that kept this beleaguered department running. His gaze naturally settled on Han Soo-min. Standing near her desk with her clipboard in hand, Soo-min radiated an air of calm authority that starkly contrasted with the frantic energy around her. Her sharp eyes flitted from one employee to another, her words steady as she directed a particularly frazzled worker to take a break. "Min-soo!" Jung-woo turned to see Kim Min-ji bounding toward him, her usual grin intact. She carried 2 steaming mugs of coffee, one of which she thrust into his hand. "You looked like you needed this," she teased, her pink-streaked hair catching the artificial light. "Thanks," he replied, taking a cautious sip. The coffee was as bitter as the department's mood, but he appreciated the gesture. "Busy day ahead," Minji continued, leaning casually against his desk. "But don't worry. With Supervisor Han here, the sky could fall, and she'd still hold it up." Jung-woo glanced at Soo-min again, who was now crouched beside a young employee, calmly explaining how to handle a difficult customer. There was something undeniably magnetic about her, an unyielding strength coupled with a quiet compassion that seemed to hold the department together. "She's impressive," Jung-woo said, almost to himself. Minji nodded enthusiastically. "You have no idea. If it weren't for her, half of us would have quit ages ago. She fights for us, you know? Even when that snake Ji-hoon tries to make her life miserable." The mention of manager Oh Ji-hoon sent a ripple of irritation through Jung-woo, though he kept his expression neutral. Later that morning, Jung-woo found himself partnered with Soo-min on a particularly tricky case. A customer had escalated their complaint to the supervisor level, demanding immediate compensation for a botched delivery. "Let's handle this together," Soo-min said, her tone all business as she handed Jung-woo a copy of the customer's file. As they navigated the call, Jung-woo was struck by Soo-min's ability to stay composed under pressure. Her voice was steady but firm, laced with a genuine desire to resolve the issue. When the customer eventually calmed down, Soo-min ended the call with a polite but decisive tone. "That's how you manage escalation," she said, turning to Jung-woo with a small smile. "You make it look easy," he admitted. "It's not," she replied, her smile fading slightly. "But it's necessary. The people who work here, they need someone to stand in the fire with them." Her words lingered with Jung-woo as the day went on. He watched her move through the department, diffusing tensions and offering encouragement where it was needed most. It became increasingly clear to him that Soo-min was the backbone of this team, the only buffer between her employees and the crushing demands of the job. But not everyone appreciated her efforts. In the afternoon, Ji-hoon made his usual appearance, his sharp voice cutting through the department like a blade. He strode into the room, holding a report that he immediately thrust into Soo-min's hands. "These numbers are unacceptable," he snapped. "Do you even know what you're doing, Supervisor Han?" Soo-min's expression remained calm, though Jung-woo noticed the way her grip on the clipboard tightened. "The team is doing their best with the resources we have, Manager Oh," she replied evenly. "Excuses," Ji-hoon spat, his lip curling. "If you can't deliver results, we'll find someone who can." Jung-woo's fists clenched at his sides as he watched the exchange. Soo-min was holding her ground, but Ji-hoon's words were laced with a venom that was hard to ignore. After Ji-hoon left, the department seemed to collectively exhale, the tension hanging in the air like a storm that had just passed. Jung-woo approached Soo-min, who was now back at her desk, reviewing the report Ji-hoon had left behind. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. She looked up, her eyes briefly meeting his. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice carried a note of exhaustion. "It's not the first time, and it won't be the last." Jung-woo hesitated, searching for the right words. "He doesn't see what you do for this team." Soo-min's lips curved into a small, bittersweet smile. "It's not about being seen, Min-soo. It's about doing what's right, even when no one notices." Her words struck a chord deep within him. As she returned to her work, Jung-woo found himself reflecting on the stark contrast between her leadership and Ji-hoon's. Soo-min's quiet strength wasn't just admirable, it was transformative. By the end of the day, Jung-woo felt a growing sense of responsibility. He had come here to observe, to gather information, but now it was becoming personal. Soo-min and her team weren't just names on a report, they were people, fighting battles he had never taken the time to understand. And for the first time in his career, Jung-woo began to question not just his company's practices, but his own role in perpetuating them. The hum of the air conditioning faded into the background as Jung-woo sat at his desk, mechanically logging details from his latest call. His hands moved over the keyboard with newfound ease, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the morning. Soo-min's words echoed in his thoughts. It's about doing what's right, even when no one notices. Jung-woo leaned back in his chair, glancing around the room. The team moved with a weary rhythm, their energy steadily dwindling as the hours wore on. Yet amid the exhaustion, there was an undercurrent of resilience, a determination to endure. His gaze eventually landed on Kim Min-ji, who was typing furiously at her desk, a faint smile tugging at her lips despite the chaos around her. Curiosity piqued, Jung-woo waited for a lull in activity before approaching her. "Min-ji," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, pushing her oversized glasses higher on her nose. "What's up, newbie? Why do you stay here?" he asked, genuinely curious. "This job, it's not easy." Min-ji tilted her head, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. "Because I have a plan," she said, leaning closer as if sharing a secret. "I'm saving up to publish my first book." "A book?" Jung-woo repeated, surprised. "Yeah," she said, her eyes lighting up. "It's going to be a romance. One of those swoon-worthy, slow-burn kinds. You know, the ones where the characters take forever to admit they're in love. But when they do, it's fireworks." Jung-woo chuckled softly. "Sounds like you've thought it through." "I have," Min-ji said with a determined nod. "This job pays the bills for now, but it's not forever. Someday I'll write full-time. That's the dream." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Jung-woo found himself smiling. But beneath her bright exterior, he could see the weight she carried, the sacrifices she made to keep that dream alive. Their conversation was interrupted by Soo-min's voice cutting through the room. "Min-ji, can you cover for Jung-ho for a few minutes? He needs a break." "On it," Min-ji replied, grabbing her headset. She gave Jung-woo a quick grin before hurrying off, leaving him alone with his thoughts. It struck him how many stories like Min-ji's must exist within the walls of this department. People with aspirations and talents far beyond what their current roles allowed. Yet here they were, grinding away in a system that seemed designed to crush them. As the afternoon wore on, Jung-woo found himself paired with Soo-min again, this time on a particularly complex case involving a shipment error that had spiraled into a full-blown customer meltdown. "Let's tackle this together," Soo-min said, handing him a copy of the relevant documents. Jung-woo nodded, following her lead. The two of them worked in tandem, navigating the intricate details of the complaint while keeping the irate customer calm. It was a delicate balance, but under Soo-min's guidance, they managed to resolve the issue without escalation. After the call ended, Jung-woo exhaled deeply. "That was intense." Soo-min smiled faintly. "It's part of the job, but you handled it well." "I had a good teacher," he replied, and for a moment, their eyes met. Soo-min's expression softened, but there was a flicker of something else there too. Hesitation, perhaps. She turned away, busying herself with her clipboard. "Can I ask you something?" Jung-woo ventured after a pause. "Of course," she said, glancing at him. "Why do you stay?" he asked, echoing his earlier question to Min-ji. "You're clearly capable of so much more. Why put up with all this?" Soo-min's grip on her clipboard tightened slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Because this team needs someone who believes in them, someone who fights for them." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that Jung-woo couldn't ignore. "And what about you?" he pressed gently. "Who fights for you?" For a brief moment, Soo-min's composure faltered, and Jung-woo saw the flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. But just as quickly, she regained her footing, offering him a small, enigmatic smile. "We all have our roles to play, Min-soo," she said quietly. "Mine is to make sure this team survives." Her response left him both impressed and unsettled. Soo-min's dedication was admirable, but it came at a cost, one he could see in the shadows beneath her eyes and the stiffness in her shoulders. As the day neared its end, Jung-woo found himself alone in the break room, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee. His thoughts churned, a mix of admiration for Soo-min and guilt for the role he had unknowingly played in perpetuating the conditions she endured. When Soo-min entered the room a few minutes later, he straightened, feeling an inexplicable urge to fill the silence. "I meant what I said earlier," he began. "You're doing an incredible job. This team is lucky to have you." Soo-min paused, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Min-soo. That means a lot." But there was a distance in her tone, a reminder that while they worked side by side, there was still a chasm of trust to bridge. As she left the room, Jung-woo was left with a deepening sense of responsibility, not just to the department, but to the people within it. The air in the customer service department was heavier than usual that morning, a tension lingering like a storm waiting to break. Even the typically upbeat Kim Min-ji seemed subdued, her usual quips replaced by quiet concentration. Jung-woo, or Min-soo as they all knew him, settled into his desk, already bracing himself for what the day would bring. "Big meeting today," Min-ji murmured as she slid into her seat beside him. Her pink-streaked hair, usually tied in a playful bun, hung loose around her shoulders. Jung-woo raised an eyebrow. "Meeting? Manager O's monthly pep talk," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm, which, as you'll see, is less about pep and more about, well, you'll see. Before Jung-woo could respond, the sound of Oh Ji-hoon's sharp footsteps echoed through the room, silencing the faint hum of conversations. The department collectively tensed, and Jung-woo watched as Soo-min straightened from her desk, her clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. Ji-hoon's arrival was as dramatic as ever. Dressed in a tailored suit that seemed out of place in the cluttered office, he scanned the room with a look of barely concealed disdain. He cleared his throat, and all eyes turned to him. "As you're all aware," Ji-hoon began, his tone icy, "our performance metrics for the last quarter have been disappointing." Jung-woo clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists under the desk. He could already tell where this was going. "Supervisor Han," Ji-hoon continued, turning his gaze to Soo-min, "what do you have to say for yourself?" Soo-min's expression remained calm, but Jung-woo noticed the slight tremor in her hand as she adjusted her clipboard. "Manager Oh," she said evenly, "our team has been working tirelessly, often exceeding the limits of their shifts. The issue isn't with their dedication, it's with the unrealistic expectations being placed on them." Ji-hoon's lips curled into a sneer. "Excuses, Supervisor Han. What I want are solutions." Soo-min opened her mouth to respond, but Ji-hoon raised a hand, cutting her off. "If this team doesn't meet its targets by the end of the month, I'll personally see to it that changes are made. Drastic ones." The room fell silent as Ji-hoon turned on his heel and strode out, leaving a trail of unease in his wake. Jung-woo's chest burned with frustration, but his attention was drawn to Soo-min, who stood rooted to the spot, her knuckles white against the clipboard. Jung-woo couldn't take it anymore. Rising from his desk, he approached her. "Supervisor Han," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you okay?" She blinked, as if shaken from a daze, and offered him a faint smile. "I'm fine, Min-soo. Thank you." "You don't have to handle this alone," he said, his tone firmer now. Soo-min's smile faltered, and for a moment, she looked as though she might say something. But instead, she nodded and returned to her desk, burying herself in the mountain of reports awaiting her. The rest of the day passed in a blur of calls and complaints, the team's usual rhythm disrupted by the weight of Ji-hoon's words. The tension was palpable, and Jung-woo could feel the morale of the department slipping further with each passing hour. By late afternoon, the tipping point came. A call from a particularly hostile customer escalated into a shouting match, and before anyone could intervene, the employee handling it slammed their headset down and stormed out of the room, tears streaming down their face. Soo-min was there in an instant, taking over the call and calming the customer with her characteristic poise. But as soon as the call ended, she turned to the team, her voice firm. "Take 5 minutes, all of you. Go." The team hesitated, glancing at one another uncertainly, but the steel in Soo-min's tone left no room for argument. As the room emptied, Jung-woo lingered, his heart pounding. "Soo-min," he said, dropping the pretense of formality in his concern. She turned to him, and for the first time, he saw the cracks in her composure. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, her shoulders tense with the effort of holding herself together. "I can't keep watching this," he said, his voice low but urgent. "This isn't sustainable, for you or the team." Her lips parted, but whatever words she meant to say were lost in the weight of her silence. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely audible. "What choice do we have, Min-soo? This is the reality we live in." Jung-woo's stomach twisted with guilt. He wanted to tell her the truth, to reveal who he really was and promise that he could change things. But he knew that the timing wasn't right. Not yet. Instead, he placed a hand on her desk, leaning closer. "Maybe it doesn't have to be," he said. Before Soo-min could respond, the team began trickling back into the room, their faces still pale with stress. The moment between them evaporated, replaced by the harsh reality of the job. But as Jung-woo returned to his desk, he made a silent vow. He couldn't keep hiding in the shadows while the people around him suffered. The time to act was coming, and when it did, he would be ready. The air in the customer service department crackled with tension. Han Soo-min stood near her desk, her sharp eyes scanning the room as the team worked through another grueling morning. Jung-woo, or Min-soo, watched her from his corner, sensing the strain she carried. Ji-hoon's ultimatum hung over the department like a thundercloud, and every passing hour felt heavier. The day took a turn when a particularly irate customer stormed into the department. Jung-woo's head snapped up as the commotion began, the man's booming voice cutting through the usual hum of ringing phones and muted conversations. "I've had it with this place," the customer roared, waving a receipt in the air. "You people are useless!" Soo-min immediately stepped forward, her calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the man's fury. "Sir, I understand you're upset. Let's step aside so we can resolve this," she said, gesturing toward a quieter corner. But the man was having none of it. "No! I've wasted hours dealing with your incompetent staff, and now I want answers." Jung-woo rose from his seat instinctively, his fists clenched at his sides. Soo-min glanced back at him, a silent warning in her eyes. "Don't interfere." With careful, measured words, she managed to de-escalate the situation, though the man left with a sour expression and muttered threats of legal action. As the door swung shut behind him, the room exhaled collectively. Jung-woo approached Soo-min as she returned to her desk. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying her exhaustion. "This isn't the first time, and it won't be the last." "But it shouldn't be like this," Jung-woo said, his voice low. "You can't keep carrying all of this on your shoulders." Soo-min hesitated, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, Jung-woo thought she might say something, but before she could respond, Ji-hoon entered the room, his presence as unwelcome as ever. "Supervisor Han," he barked, striding toward her with his usual air of superiority. "A VIP client has filed a formal complaint. Care to explain?" Soo-min straightened, her composure snapping into place. "The situation was resolved, Manager O. The customer was upset, but—" "I don't care about excuses," Ji-hoon interrupted, his voice dripping with disdain. "This department's performance is unacceptable, and your inability to manage is costing us business. If you can't fix this, I'll find someone who can." Jung-woo felt his temper flare. Before he could stop himself, he stepped forward. "That's enough." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. Soo-min looked at him in alarm, shaking her head slightly. But Jung-woo ignored her. Ji-hoon turned to him, his lips curling into a sneer. "And who do you think you are, Min-soo? You're just a temp. Stay in your lane." For a brief moment, Jung-woo hesitated, his heart pounding. The urge to reveal himself warred with the fear of the fallout. But as his gaze swept over the room, the tired faces of the team, the defiance in Soo-min's eyes, he knew he couldn't stay silent. "I'm Lee Jung-woo," he said, his voice steady. CEO of Sunlight Plaza. A stunned silence filled the room, the weight of his words crashing down like a tidal wave. Ji-hoon's face paled, his bravado faltering as he took a step back. "What?" he sputtered, his voice barely above a whisper. Jung-woo turned to the team, his expression softening. "I came here to understand what this department goes through, and what I've seen has been eye-opening. The pressure you face, the lack of support, it's unacceptable. And it's my responsibility to change that." Soo-min stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. "You're the CEO?" she asked, her voice shaking with a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. "Yes," Jung-woo said, his chest tightening. "I'm sorry for deceiving you, but I needed to see the truth for myself." Her expression hardened, and she took a step back. "You lied to all of us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You pretended to be one of us." "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," Jung-woo said, his voice urgent. "I just wanted to understand what was really happening here." Before he could say more, Soo-min turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. The team looked at him with a mix of confusion and cautious hope. Ji-hoon, however, recovered quickly, his voice dripping with false charm. "Mr. Lee, I had no idea you were observing. Let me assure you—" "Enough, Ji-hoon," Jung-woo said sharply, his gaze hardening. "We'll discuss your behavior later. For now, I want everyone to focus on their work. Changes are coming, but we'll take it one step at a time." As the room slowly returned to life, Jung-woo felt the weight of his decision settle on his shoulders. He had revealed the truth, but at what cost? Soo-min's expression lingered in his mind, her look of betrayal cutting deeper than he'd expected. For the first time in his career, Jung-woo felt vulnerable. And for the first time, he realized that vulnerability might be the key to truly fixing what was broken. The aftermath of Jung-woo's revelation spread through the department like wildfire. Whispers floated from desk to desk, a mix of awe, confusion, and disbelief. The once familiar air of resignation was now charged with uncertainty. Soo-min, however, remained silent, retreating into her role with a professionalism that only thinly veiled the storm brewing within her. Jung-woo sat at his desk, his hands resting on the keyboard, though the screen in front of him was blank. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one circling back to Soo-min's expression when she learned the truth. The betrayal in her eyes had pierced him more deeply than he'd anticipated, and the memory lingered like an open wound. He stood abruptly, drawing a few glances from his team, and made his way toward Soo-min, who was bent over a stack of reports at her desk. "Soo-min," he said softly, but his voice carried weight. She didn't look up. "Supervisor Han," she corrected coldly. Jung-woo flinched but pressed on. "We need to talk." "I'm busy," she replied, her tone clipped. "This won't take long," he said, his voice firm but patient. Soo-min exhaled sharply and set her pen down, finally meeting his gaze. Her eyes were guarded, a far cry from the warmth and quiet strength he had come to admire. "What is it, Mr. Lee?" Jung-woo ignored the bitterness in her voice. "I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But I need you to understand why I did this." "Understand?" she repeated, her voice rising slightly. She stood, her chair scraping against the floor. "You lied to all of us. You pretended to be one of us, to care about what we go through, but you were just gathering data for your next big decision." "That's not true," Jung-woo said, his tone soft but insistent. "I came here because I wanted to see the truth. I needed to understand what was really happening in this department, the challenges you face, the sacrifices you make. And I've seen it, Soo-min. I see you." Her expression flickered, the wall she had built around herself trembling for a moment before she strengthened it again. "You don't know anything about me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jung-woo stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're wrong. I've seen how you hold this team together, how you fight for them even when it costs you. I know how much you care, even when no one else seems to notice." Soo-min's eyes shimmered, and for a brief moment, Jung-woo thought she might let him in. But then she shook her head, stepping back. "Words are easy, Mr. Lee. Prove it." Her words echoed in his mind long after she turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the middle of the bustling office. That afternoon, Jung-woo called a meeting. The team gathered reluctantly, their expressions ranging from curious to wary. Soo-min stood at the back, her arms crossed and her gaze unreadable. "First, I want to apologize," Jung-woo began, his voice steady but sincere. "I deceived you, and for that, I am sorry. But I want you to know that I've seen the reality of what you go through every day, and I am committed to making things better." A murmur ran through the room, skepticism thick in the air. "I've already taken steps to remove some of the pressures you've been facing," Jung-woo continued. "Starting next week, we'll be reducing call quotas to more realistic levels and bringing in additional staff to support the team." The murmurs grew louder, this time tinged with cautious optimism. Jung-woo's eyes swept the room, searching for Soo-min's reaction, but her expression remained stoic. "And one more thing," he added, his voice growing firmer. "Manager Oh Ji-hoon has been relieved of his duties effective immediately. His treatment of this team was unacceptable, and I won't allow it to continue." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. For a moment, no one moved or spoke, and then Minji's voice broke the stillness. "Is this for real?" she asked, her wide eyes fixed on him. Jung-woo nodded. "It is." A ripple of stunned relief passed through the team. Some exchanged glances, others sighed audibly, and a few even smiled. The tension that had gripped the department for so long seemed to loosen, if only slightly. As the team dispersed, Minji approached Jung-woo, her usual playful grin returning. "You might not be so bad after all, Mr. CEO," she said, nudging him lightly. Jung-woo smiled faintly, but his gaze drifted to Soo-min, who lingered near her desk, her expression unreadable. He made his way to her, his heart pounding. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" she asked, her tone flat. "For showing me what leadership really means," he replied, his voice earnest. "I've been so focused on numbers and profits that I forgot about the people who make it all possible. You reminded me of what's important." Soo-min's lips parted as if to respond, but instead, she shook her head. "You've made promises before, Mr. Lee. Let's see if you can keep them this time." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Jung-woo alone once again. As the day came to an end, Jung-woo sat in his office, staring out at the sprawling cityscape. The weight of his decisions pressed heavily on him, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of hope. Change wouldn't come overnight, but it had to start somewhere. And for Jung-woo, that start was here, in the small but resilient corner of his empire that had taught him what it truly meant to lead. The atmosphere in the customer service department was markedly different the next morning. While the faint hum of ringing phones and murmured conversations still filled the air, there was a lightness that hadn't been there before. The tension that had clung to the team like a dark cloud seemed to have lifted, if only slightly. Jung-woo, or rather, Mr. Lee now, stood near the entrance, watching as his employees adjusted to the news of Ji-hoon's departure and the promise of incoming changes. The once frantic energy had softened into something cautious but hopeful. Kim Min-ji, ever the team's spirited spark, twirled a pen between her fingers as she grinned at Jung-woo. "You weren't kidding about Ji-hoon," she said, her voice tinged with admiration. "Honestly, I thought you'd just disappear like every other suit who shows up down here." "I'm not every other suit," Jung-woo replied with a faint smile. "Clearly," Min-ji said, her grin widening. "But don't think this means we're letting you off easy. You've got a lot to prove, Mr. CEO." Jung-woo chuckled softly. Fair enough. As the morning unfolded, Soo-min entered the room, her step steady and purposeful. Her clipboard was tucked under her arm, and her expression was as composed as ever, though Jung-woo caught a flicker of something softer in her gaze when their eyes met. "Supervisor Han," Jung-woo said, stepping forward. "Can I have a word with you?" She hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Of course." He led her to a quiet corner of the department, away from the curious gazes of their colleagues. "I wanted to thank you again," he began, his voice earnest. "Not just for what you've done for this team, but for the lessons you've taught me." Soo-min raised an eyebrow, her arms crossing lightly over her chest. "Lessons?" "Yes," Jung-woo said. "About leadership, empathy, and what it really means to serve the people who rely on you." She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she sighed, her posture softening. "You're saying all the right things, Mr. Lee, but words don't fix broken systems. Actions do." Jung-woo nodded. "I know. That's why I've taken steps to start addressing the issues here. The additional staff I promised will begin next week, and I've scheduled a meeting with the team to gather their input on how we can improve working conditions." Soo-min's eyes widened slightly, though her expression remained guarded. "You're serious about this?" "Completely," he said. "But I'll need your help. You know this team better than anyone. You're the heart of this department, Soo-min." Her cheeks flushed faintly at his words, but she quickly composed herself. "I'll help, but only because the team deserves it. Not because I trust you yet." "That's fair," Jung-woo replied, his tone gentle. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. True to his word, Jung-woo called a meeting with the team, inviting them to share their experiences and suggestions for improvement. At first, the employees were hesitant, their voices subdued as they shared minor grievances. But as Jung-woo listened intently, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions, the dam began to break. "I've been here for 3 years, one employee said, his voice wavering with emotion. "And this is the first time someone in charge has actually asked what we need." Min-ji chimed in next, her usual humor replaced with sincerity. "We're not asking for miracles, just to be treated like people, not numbers." Soo-min, who had been quietly observing from the back of the room, felt a strange mix of pride and cautious optimism as she watched her team begin to open up. When the meeting ended, Jung-woo approached her. "What did you think?" he asked. "It's a good start," she admitted, though her tone remained measured. "But there's still a long way to go." "I wouldn't expect anything less," he replied with a small smile. That evening, as the office emptied, Jung-woo lingered behind, reviewing the notes he had taken during the meeting. The list of grievances and suggestions was long, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, he felt energized. "You're still here?" He looked up to see Soo-min standing in the doorway, her arms crossed and her expression softer than usual. "I could ask you the same thing," he said with a faint smile. She stepped inside, letting the door close behind her. "Old habits. There's always something to finish." "Same," Jung-woo said, gesturing to the pile of notes on his desk. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the day settling around them. Then, Soo-min spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "You've surprised me, Mr. Lee," she said. "I didn't think you'd follow through. But you have." Jung-woo met her gaze, his chest tightening at the hint of vulnerability in her eyes. "I meant what I said, Soo-min. I'm committed to making this better. For you, for the team, for everyone." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Then let's see where this goes." As Soo-min left the office, Jung-woo felt a flicker of hope. Change was never easy, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. The journey wasn't over, but the first steps had been taken. And for Jung-woo, that was enough. A week later, the customer service department was nearly unrecognizable. The first wave of changes had been implemented. Additional staff had joined the team, the workstations had been upgraded, and the oppressive quotas that once dictated every moment of their day had been reduced to a manageable level. For the first time in years, there was laughter in the air, a light, tentative sound, but one that carried the promise of renewal. Even the ever-present hum of ringing phones seemed less grating in the new atmosphere. Jung-woo stood by the large conference table in the center of the department, observing the team as they worked. Their energy, though not entirely restored, was noticeably lighter. His chest swelled with pride as he saw Minji animatedly explaining a new process to one of the recruits, her pink-streaked hair bouncing as she gestured enthusiastically. At the head of the room, Soo-min addressed the team, her calm, confident voice carrying across the space. "Remember, if you run into any issues with the new procedures, come to me directly. We're still ironing out the details, but we'll get there together." Her words were met with nods of agreement and murmurs of affirmation. For the first time, Jung-woo saw his employees not just surviving, but beginning to thrive. Later that afternoon, Jung-woo called for a formal meeting. The team gathered hesitantly, their past experiences with department-wide meetings still fresh in their minds. But as they settled into their seats, they noticed something different. The usual tension and dread were replaced with curiosity and, for some, cautious optimism. Jung-woo stood at the front of the room, his stance confident but approachable. Soo-min sat nearby, her clipboard resting on her lap, though her gaze remained guarded. "First, I want to thank all of you," Jung-woo began, his deep voice steady and sincere. "This department is the heart of Sunlight Plaza. You're the ones who ensure that every customer's experience is handled with care, and your efforts don't go unnoticed, at least not anymore." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. "To show our appreciation," he continued, "we're implementing a new program to reward excellence and provide additional training for those who want to grow within the company. Starting next month, we'll also introduce flexible schedules and mental health support for every employee in this department." The room fell silent for a moment before Minji, ever the bold one, raised her hand. "Wait, are you serious?" Jung-woo smiled faintly. Completely. The room erupted into applause, a sound that echoed with relief and gratitude. Soo-min glanced around, her lips twitching into the faintest smile as she saw her team's enthusiasm. After the meeting, Jung-woo sought Soo-min out, finding her by the window overlooking the plaza below. The late afternoon sunlight framed her figure, casting a warm glow that softened the lines of her expression. "You're quiet," Jung-woo said, approaching her cautiously. Soo-min turned to him, her face unreadable. "There's a lot to process." "Fair," he admitted, "but I hope it's good news to process." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. "It is. I won't deny that things feel different, better." Jung-woo's chest tightened at the note of hope in her voice. "It's only the beginning, Soo-min. There's still a lot of work to do, but I'm not going anywhere. You have my word." Her gaze softened, though the guarded edge remained. "You've kept your promises so far. That's more than I expected." "I don't take promises lightly," he said, his voice low. "Especially when they're to someone like you." The air between them shifted, a quiet understanding settling in. Soo-min's cheeks flushed faintly, but she held his gaze, her own emotions flickering just beneath the surface. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice quiet but sincere. "For listening. For trying." "Thank you," Jung-woo replied, his tone equally soft. "For showing me what I was blind to." For a moment, the noise of the department faded into the background, leaving only the two of them in the golden light. As the day came to an end, Jung-woo gathered the team once more, this time in the main atrium of the plaza. The open space, usually bustling with shoppers, had been transformed into a small celebration. Tables were lined with snacks and drinks, and a banner reading "Thank you, team" hung overhead. The employees laughed and mingled, their smiles brighter and their steps lighter. Even Soo-min seemed to relax, a small but genuine smile gracing her lips as she spoke with Min-ji and a few others. Jung-woo watched from a distance, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. For the first time, he felt like he had truly earned the title of leader. That night, as he left the plaza, Jung-woo found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. What had started as an experiment, a way to uncover the truth behind the whispers of discontent, had turned into something far more meaningful. He had come to understand not just the struggles of his employees, but the strength and resilience they carried with them every day, and in turn, they had shown him the kind of leader he could be. As the cool night air brushed against his face, Jung-woo felt something he hadn't experienced in years: fulfillment. Change wasn't easy, but it was possible. And for the first time, he believed in it, not just for the company, but for himself.